All right, so we are continuing our series through the book of Acts. We have come a long way, and we are almost to the end of this series. And for a long time throughout this series, we have been following along with the journeys and the mission work of Paul as he travels throughout the area, as he does God's work, as he encounters all kinds of obstacles, and he overcomes them by God's power time and again. And we see this story that is unstoppable, this story of God's movement in the world, the church, that is unstoppable. As I've been studying Paul, as I've been reading these stories to prepare for lessons and reading and rereading and sort of reflecting, I've started to wonder and ask myself the question, when I see what Paul does and what Paul is up against and how he perseveres, I ask myself, could I have done the same thing? And I wonder if maybe you have considered that as well as we read these stories, not just of Paul, but of other heroes that we think of the Christian faith, and we see their stories and we see what they overcome. Could we have done that also? If we encountered the same situations, how would we fare? And as I reflected on that, I realized that the answer might be no, at least not on my own. I don't think I could have made it through what Paul made it through. And if you feel that way, then maybe some encouragement is that I don't think Paul could make it through on his own either. That he wasn't on his own, that he was empowered by a force that is beyond this world. And that is what we're talking about when we say that this is unstoppable. He is empowered not by himself, not just because he's got a lot of gumption in his spirit, but because he has the power of God working through him. And he is empowered by the Holy Spirit, and it is the same Spirit that empowers you and empowers me to do amazing things in God's kingdom. He was running on a different type of fuel than the rest of this world, and we are too. And before we get into the part of the story that we're going to look at today for Paul, I want to remember for just a moment where it all began, where this guy named Saul was out to put a stop to the church. He was on the other side of God's unstoppable movement, and he found that he himself was the one who was stopped on the Damascus road, blinded by a light that spoke to him. It was the voice of Jesus saying, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And he changed Saul's life. And then Jesus appeared to another guy named Ananias, and he told him to meet up with this guy named Saul and to assist him, basically, in this conversion part of his life. And Ananias said to the Lord, "Don't you know who this is? Are we talking about the same Saul, the one that's out to persecute Christians?" And this is what God told Ananias. The Lord said to Ananias, "Go, for Paul is a chosen instrument of mine. Paul is a chosen instrument of mine to carry my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel, for I will show him how much he must suffer for the sake of my name." We have seen over the last several weeks, or months, I suppose, we have seen how this has unfolded. We have seen Paul suffer time and again. We have seen Paul go into cities and to bring God's name before the children of Israel, go into the synagogues everywhere he goes and preach Jesus. We have seen him reach out more than anyone else has to the Gentiles, something that really got him into hot water with Jews that didn't like that sort of thing. But what about the kings? It's the kings part of that message that the Lord had for Ananias. It's the king's part that we get to today. Of Saul, of Paul fulfilling this word about his life, that he would carry God's name to not just Gentiles, not just Israel, but to kings. He would bring it before kings. This is a big and bold and high calling that is laid on Paul. It's really amazing if somebody told you you are going to be somebody that speaks to kings. That's pretty amazing. But it comes with, as you saw, it comes with suffering. He says, I will show him how much he will suffer for my name. That's one of the difficult truths of our faith. In God's kingdom, the path of greatness is marked with suffering and calls for humility. In God's kingdom, the path of greatness, like top tier kinds of stuff, is marked with suffering. Really, that should be our expectation. That's what we see throughout Scripture. Old and New Testament, we see God's people going through difficult, suffering paths as they carry out God's mission. We see Jesus talk about it. In this world, you will have trouble. We see Jesus walk that path and go to the cross himself. And he says to his followers before that, he says, take up a cross and follow me. We ought to know, we ought to expect that this is a path of suffering. And we do to an extent, or at least we are willing to say that at times, but our hearts are often inclined to resist that idea, to have different expectations, or at least hope that it's different for us. We want to read the story of Paul. We want it to be written a little different way sometimes. Like we want Paul or any missionary for that matter to walk into a town with this message of the gospel, the good news, that we can be free from the sins that entangle us, that we can be brought into right relationship with the very creator of the universe. This good news that we have a good king that reigns over all things and we are subject only to him. Instead of these broken systems of leadership that are around our world, but led by broken people, we have a good and perfect king. This good news, we hope for a missionary like Paul to walk into a town and share this message, and for the town to just break out in revival and to celebrate that finally this thing that we've hoped for has come to pass. We want Paul to be lifted up in celebration and joy, and instead, we find riots like in Ephesus where people want to kill him. We find him going to God's holy city, to Jerusalem, and before he's even been there for 2 weeks, they're dragging him out of the temple and trying to murder him. It's not the way the story is supposed to go, somewhere deep inside of us. Jesus' disciples, when Jesus was there bodily with them, had the same type of feeling. They believed he was the Messiah. They believed he was the one that was supposed to reign on the throne. But they had hopes for that. They had hopes that meant because they were with him, they would be victorious in a very earthly kind of way. They wanted to sit at his right hand and have some sort of status in the world because they were with the one true king. And we see Jesus dealing with that. Luke 22, verse 24. It says, the disciples began to argue among themselves about who would be the greatest among them. And Jesus told them, in this world, the kings and great men lord it over their people. Yet they're called friends of the people. But among you, it will be different. Those who are the greatest among you should take the lowest rank. And the leader should be like a servant. He says, it's just flipping your expectations upside down. The greatest in God's kingdom is a servant. The last will be first, he says, and the first will be last. And I think this teaching of Jesus that he tried over and over to get into their heads, Paul ends up representing pretty well. Paul ends up being a good example of this idea that the path of greatness is marked with suffering, and it calls us to a position of humility. Paul has only proclaimed in all the places he's been, he's only proclaimed the hope that the Jews had longed for centuries. That's all he's been doing, is proclaiming this fruition of what they had actually been hoping for. He says, it's here, it has come to pass, it's in Jesus. And for proclaiming their very hope, he is hated by many of them. As I mentioned, he has made it to Jerusalem. We've seen that over the last couple of weeks. Paul in Jerusalem. And he gets there and they're warning him about it. Like, people have been saying things about you, Paul. James tells him, people have been talking about you and saying all these rumors are going around. We need to show them that you're a good Jew, so maybe they'll back off. And they try it, but it doesn't work. And like I said, they drag Paul out and they accuse him of things that were false. And they try to kill him. And the Romans come in and scoop him up and take him into the barracks to protect him and begin to ask him some questions. And Paul goes out and addresses the crowd, and then he comes back in. And the Romans just kind of at a loss for what to do with this guy. The crowd seems to be really mad at him, and it's causing all of this trouble. But the Romans are having a hard time figuring out what exactly he's done wrong. And Paul's a Roman citizen. They can't just treat him however they want. He has certain rights. And so they end up shipping him off down to Caesarea. And he spends some time there with the governor of the region named Felix. And he actually spends 2 years around Felix. Felix keeps him in prison, and every now and then Felix would call him out and have a good conversation with Paul. He seems to have some curiosity, or possibly some admiration for Paul, but he hears him out for 2 years. But because he wants to keep the Jews on his side, because he's the governor of the region, he keeps Paul locked up for 2 years. Eventually, there's another governor, a guy named Porcius Festus, who takes over the region from Felix. And the Jews are still the people that he wants to keep happy because they are dominant in the region, and so he does them a favor, it says, and keeps Paul in prison some more. And when he goes to Jerusalem, they say, we got to do something about this Paul guy. They're still on it. They want to try to trap Paul. They want to try to ambush Paul in something, and Festus invites them to come down to Caesarea and present their case. And this is what happens here. Down in Caesarea, Festus took his seat on the tribunal and ordered Paul to be brought. When he had arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many and serious charges against him that they could not prove. Paul argued in his defense, neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I committed any offense. But Festus, again, wishing to do the Jews a favor, keep them on his side, said to Paul, do you wish to go up to Jerusalem and there be tried on these charges before me? So Festus is there, the guy in charge of things, and he is hearing what they have to say. And what Luke gives us is surely a summary of what all went on there, because it says they brought many charges and they were serious and they couldn't prove them. We don't know what all they had to say, but we can infer some things. And Paul, again, I think this is sort of a summary of all that Paul had to say. He's saying, I didn't do anything against them. I didn't do anything against you. I haven't done anything. I'm not guilty of any of this business. There is no evidence of wrongdoing. But notice what's going on here. Notice the way that this is written. What is really going on here? Paul's guilt or innocence is not really the point for Festus. It doesn't really matter to the Jews either whether he's innocent or not. The Jews have no real case, but they're trying to use their local clout to eliminate a threat. They just want him gone. It doesn't matter what they can try to pin on him. They're just throwing everything against the wall to see what sticks. They're just trying to get rid of him. And Festus doesn't really care. He does not care about Paul. And he doesn't really care about the Jews either. He just wants to make sure the people in power are on his side so that they don't give a bad report back to Rome and cause trouble for Festus. And ultimately, this is virtually the same situation that Jesus was in with Pilate. Pilate didn't care about Jesus, didn't care about the crowd. He just wanted to keep the peace so that he could maintain his position. And what we realize in reading this story is something that was true then, has always been true, and is true still today, that in this world, truth and justice are often overshadowed by agendas and power plays. I thought somebody might say amen to that. It is often overshadowed by agendas and power plays. We see it all the time, don't we? We see it all the time. And probably when I say that, the first thing that comes to mind is the stuff going on with government things and politics and all this stuff. And that's certainly big and huge at play. But I want you to think even beyond that. I want you to think about the ways that agendas and power plays work in your workplace. People don't always care about what's true or what is right. They've got their own agenda. They want to gain whatever they can. Think about how this works in family dynamics. People trying to get the upper hand. Think about how this works in some friend groups. Agendas, power plays. It doesn't matter what's true. It doesn't matter what's right. What matters is being right. And if we're not careful, this will be the way that it is in church as well. Amen. If we're not careful, then no longer will it matter what is actually right, what is actually true. What matters is being right and seeming true. If we are not careful. And this is why this truth, this second truth, is why in the first truth there is suffering in walking God's path. It's why there is, because we are, as Troy said in this year, we are fish swimming upstream. There's going to be suffering when we are trying to do what is right in a world that doesn't care about what is right. There is going to be suffering when we are seeking justice, a true kind of justice from God in a world that has redefined the term to match their agendas. People often are not after truth or justice no matter what they say. They just want to win. They just want to avoid having to change. And that's not new today. I just want you to see that that's the way things work in this world because it's broken. Isaiah said, Isaiah 59, verse 14, justice is turned back. Righteousness stands far away. Truth has stumbled in the public squares and uprightness cannot enter. Truth is lacking. And he who departs from evil makes himself prey. The Lord saw it. And it displeased him that there was no justice. He saw that there was no man and wondered that there was no one to intercede. In other words, nobody stood up for what was right. And then God's own arm brought salvation. And his righteousness upheld him. If we really want things to be put right in the world, like if we really want actual righteousness and justice and truth to reign, then we have to seek it from God himself. It doesn't come by our bright ideas. It comes by the power and action of God in the world. I believe, by and large, that people in this world really do want things to be right. I think deep down, almost everyone, I'll say, wants truth and justice. But then they seek it out and perhaps discover that it means letting go of those agendas, letting go of getting their way, letting go of being in charge of things, and that's too hard to do, and so we settle. We settle for something else. But I think deep down inside all of us, there is a longing for things to be better. So what does that mean for us? What does that mean for us if we are God's people who long for God's true justice, God's true righteousness and truth to reign? Well, it means prayer more than anything. It means constantly looking at our world and going, this isn't right, and hitting our knees before we do anything else. It means bringing it to our God, and in that process, seeking to be an instrument of God working through our lives to make His difference, not ours, but be an instrument of Him. So back to Paul. He is there in Caesarea, there with Festus, there with people hurling accusations that they can't prove at him. And Festus says, tell you what, Paul, how about we just take this back up to Jerusalem and we'll sort it all out there. That doesn't sound like a good idea, I imagine, to Paul. He remembers what happened the last time he was there. So what does Paul do? Life is on the line, and everyone around him is only concerned about their agendas and keeping their power intact. This is what he says, verse 10. Paul said, I am standing before Caesar's tribunal where I ought to be tried. To the Jews, I have done no wrong, as you yourself know very well. If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything for which I deserve to die, I do not seek to escape death. But if there is nothing to their charges against me, then no one can give me up to them. I appeal to Caesar. I imagine when he said those last three words, the crowd gasped. We'll come back to that. Then Festus, when he had conferred with his council, answered, to Caesar you have appealed, to Caesar you shall go. Paul is a Roman citizen, as has been established a few times. He is a Roman citizen, and that comes with certain rights and privileges. One of those is that he has, like every Roman citizen, the right, in his case, to appeal to the highest authority in the land, to Caesar, to the emperor of the Roman Empire himself. Every Roman citizen has this right, but to exercise that right is incredibly risky. Because you can imagine that the emperor of the Roman Empire does not really wish to trouble himself with little matters from out in the empire and places that he doesn't really care about, right? And so you're taking the risk of bringing a case to Caesar that just irritates the man who has the ability to snap his finger and end your life. It's very dangerous. And so that's why I say that to do this, the crowd probably would have gasped. But I think that Paul sees now how he can get to Rome. I think he sees the path forward. I think he believes that getting to Rome is sort of his destiny, sort of his calling. He has talked about it already before. He wants to get there, and he's in chains, but I think that he now sees the way that he can go. And he's taking it. The emperor at this time, by the way, is Nero. The Nero who became infamous for his mistreatment. That's putting it too lightly. His persecution, his torture of Christians. This is who Paul is going to appeal to. And so that's what he does. He's exercising his right, but look, let's back up from that. Look at the way that he frames his appeal. He says to them, I am not guilty. I have done nothing wrong. Understand that I'm not trying to just get out of any punishment that is coming my way. If I've done something wrong, then I accept it. If I have indeed broken the law, then I will accept the punishment for that. And so Paul speaks with a lot of boldness here, but he speaks as a man of integrity. And he shows us how we face this injustice in the world. That in the face of injustice, we continue to stand. We continue to stand in all boldness and full of integrity by God's power. We stand in all integrity and by God's power. You know, when you think over Paul's story, and it's not over yet, there is more to come. All that he's gone through, it's really amazing to me that somebody in that position never really gave up, right? I think so many people, when faced with so many obstacles and with so many people against them, how many would have just said, you know what, I can't do this anymore. I just let somebody else take it from here. I'm done. I mean, just imagine being in his spot. Where it seems like, I mean, we have the benefit of hindsight, but it seems like basically everyone's against you. You've been giving yourself to this cause, and you just keep running into this situation where people are just lying. The people that are supposed to be God's people are lying about you to try to take you down. How long would you put up with that? You might say, what's the use? This isn't making a difference to anybody anymore. But that wasn't Paul. He never gave up. He continued to stand. He continued to speak boldly, and he maintained integrity. He didn't justify any sort of straying from the path. And he gave his own prayer request when he wrote Ephesians. He wrote in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 18. He's giving this prayer request, and he says, pray at all times in the Spirit with all prayer and supplication. And to that end, keep alert with all perseverance, making supplication for all the saints and also for me. He says, pray for me, that words may be given to me in opening my mouth boldly to proclaim the mystery of the gospel, for which I am an ambassador in chains, that I may declare it boldly as I ought to speak. Paul knew that without God's help, he couldn't persevere in this. And he asked for prayers. And I think we see in his story that God answered those prayers. He persevered. He does. So now Festus has another layer to this problem. After hearing from the Jewish leaders and hearing from Paul, he has this other problem to sort out. After Paul has now appealed to Caesar, and he says, okay, to Caesar you'll go then. Now what is the message that Festus sends with him to Caesar? He's got this guy that he's sending all the way to the top, in chains, probably at great expense. Surely there must be some very serious charges against this person, but he doesn't know what to say. He doesn't know what the message is to send to Caesar, and he can't just send him all alone. During this time, King Herod Agrippa II, actually, he's the last in the Herod dynasty. He is the great-grandson of Herod the Great. But he comes down to Caesarea, and he and Festus have a conversation, and Festus tells him all about this situation with Paul. And he tells him, I haven't been able to find anything wrong with this guy. And Agrippa, the king, says, okay, I want to hear what he has to say. And because of all of this, the very next day, Paul has an audience with a king, fulfilling what Jesus said about him in the beginning. Agrippa decides he wants to hear from Paul, and Paul comes and he tells Agrippa the whole story again. He walks through how he had persecuted the church and how he had been on his way to Damascus and how the light came around him and how he then changed the course of his life, and God sent him off on this mission to the Gentiles. And as he's speaking, Festus speaks up and interrupts Paul. And this is what he says. Paul was saying these things in his defense, and Festus said with a loud voice, Paul, You are out of your mind. Your great learning is driving you out of your mind. But Paul said, I am not out of my mind, most excellent Festus, but I am speaking true and rational words. For the king, Agrippa, knows about these things, and to him I speak boldly. For I am persuaded that none of these things has escaped his notice. For this hasn't been done in a corner. I love the way that Paul speaks here. But notice the charge against him here by Festus. Interrupting Paul's story, Festus says, Paul, you are crazy. You are crazy. You're wasting the king's time with this nonsense. And maybe Festus is trying to get ahead of this and wanted the king to know that if the king, in fact, if just in case the king thought that his time was being wasted by this crazy man, that Festus agreed that this is crazy. Paul's a crazy person. But I don't think this is the first time that Paul has been called crazy. I don't think so. He responds to that kind of charge when he writes the Corinthians. This is not the first time, and so he's not thrown by it. He just takes it in stride and ends up doubling down on this crazy talk that he has. And he says essentially, Festus, Agrippa, look around. This is not some obscure thing that's been done in the corner. The Messiah is changing the world, and it's happening all around you. This is not secret. What would be truly crazy it would be that you ignore what God is doing all around us. The Romans had a vast and efficient spy network. They were very good at spying out movements that were happening within the empire. And the Christian movement certainly would not have gone unnoticed. They would have had spies all over the place, making sure this wasn't a threat to Roman rule. And so that's why he's saying, you know what's going on. You know what's happening here. And so, if Paul is crazy, it's a good kind of crazy. And it should not be alarming or surprising that our faith seems strange to the world. That should not surprise us. Like I said, if Paul is crazy, it's a good kind of crazy. It's like he's one of the few that is standing right side up in a world that is upside down. He is the kind of crazy, the kind of strange that is holy, set apart, different, which is a good thing in a broken world. It is a kind of difference, a kind of strangeness that is a signpost pointing beyond this brokenness to something better, to something, like I've said, that we all long for. If we are doing that strangeness right, if we are living out the calling that God has placed on us correctly, then it is inevitable that the world will look at us and say, that's weird. That should be expected. When Paul wrote to the Philippians chapter 2, verse 14, he told them, do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding fast to the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I may be proud that I did not run in vain or labor in vain. He says, yeah, you guys are weird, but it's a good weird. It's a weird that is like the weirdness of the stars amidst the blackness of the sky. It is lights shining in the darkness, in the vast expanse of the emptiness of space. What is strange and unusual out there are the stars. They take up far less space than the blackness, the darkness of the night sky. And so it should not be alarming or surprising that our faith seems strange. It is not our goal to try to fit in. It is not our goal to conform to the pattern of this world, but to be renewed in our minds, to be transformed into His image. It is our purpose to be holy, to be strange, to be a good kind of crazy, for the sake of being a vessel of God in this world. For the sake of being people that point beyond ourselves, that point beyond the brokenness to hope that we have in Him. And so Paul goes on standing there before Agrippa, and he says, King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know that you believe, which is a bold statement. And Agrippa said to Paul, I think he chuckled right here, in a short time, would you persuade me to be a Christian? And Paul said, whether short or long, I would to God that not only you, but also all who hear me this day might become such as I am. And then I think Paul chuckles, except for these chains. I love this interaction. This may be one of my favorite moments in Acts. Agrippa, you think you're going to convince me to become a Christian in this moment? Paul's like, I wish you would. And everybody else too. Be like me, except for these chains. And right there is the heart of Paul. Right there, we understand why he endures so much and perseveres through so much pain and difficulty everywhere he turns. And he perseveres in this strangeness that the world sees in him because he knows that in that strangeness is found the hope that we are missing. In that strangeness is found the true life that can be ours. And Paul wants that for everyone, and so he will continue to be strange. He will continue to be perceived as crazy, as the fish that swims against the stream, as the one who is standing upside down but knows he's maybe the only one right side up. I think that virtually no one looks at the current state of the world and thinks, yeah, it's perfect, just like this. I think that everyone is wishing for something better. And it's Jesus. It's the message that we have. Everyone wants something different than what we have right now in this world. Will we be crazy enough to show it to them? And if we won't, who will? God has used the light of the stars, those dots of light against the vast expanse of darkness in the sky. He has used those points of light to guide people. In many ways throughout history, people have navigated by the lights that shine in the darkness. And they still do. Spiritually speaking as well, God is using us as lights in this darkness to guide people through it, to guide people to Him. And Paul wrote Ephesians 5:8, this is where we'll wrap up. He says, at one time you were darkness, but now you are light in the world. You used to be just like all the other darkness, but now you're different. You're strange. You are light, so walk as children of light. So this morning, consider this message your invitation to be a good kind of crazy. Consider this your invitation to call on and stand for the truth and justice of God over and against the corrupted versions of those things in this world. May we stand firm while suffering injustice or ridicule, knowing that God can make use of your strange integrity to bring hope and life to countless souls.